Hey there, and welcome to CozySideAudio. Settle in with a soft-spoken story to help you relax, study, or drift into sleep. If you enjoy these gentle tales, tap like, share the calm, and subscribe for more cozy moments. CozySideAudio presents The Cat Who Delivered Wishes. Chapter 1: A Cat at the Window. Tobias Finch lived above a cobbler's shop that smelled of beeswax, old leather, and just the faintest trace of river mint from a cracked jar on the sill. The jar had been there for 15 years. No one remembered why. Possibly, it had once been a clever sort of remedy for squeaky soles. Possibly not. The shop sat at the crooked end of Clover Street in Larkspur Hollow, a village that had long ago given up trying to straighten itself out. The houses leaned slightly, the trees grew in spirals, and the postman, who was not fond of walking uphill in any direction, always looked mildly betrayed by the landscape. The village, for its part, didn't seem to mind. Tobias was not much different. A quiet man with spectacles always dusted in shoelace ends and a tendency to mumble at heels as if they might respond. He lived alone, except for the occasional house mouse and the steady company of his tools. His customers adored his work. There wasn't a better pair of mended boots for 20 miles, but no one could say they really knew him. He wasn't lonely, not exactly, but there were silences in his life that had gone on so long they had grown comfortable, like a pair of worn slippers that no longer pinched. On the first full moon of spring, everything changed. It began with a rustling, very faint, like paper brushing across stone. Tobias was halfway through attaching a new sole to a pair of gardening clogs and nearly missed it. But then came a thump on the windowsill. Not the kind of thump that came from a falling apple or a careless pigeon. A deliberate one. He looked up. There, sitting squarely on the ledge outside his window, was a cat. Not the fluffy village kind that yowled at night and snuck into fishmongers' bins. This one was sleek, black as chimney soot, and very still, except for its tail, which flicked once with faint disapproval. Its eyes were yellow, not merely bright but clever. They looked at Tobias like he was a pair of shoes that might just fall apart if handled too roughly. Then the cat turned and leapt lightly onto the sill outside, leaving behind a single object, a folded piece of parchment, sealed with a circle of red wax. There was no stamp, no address, only 3 words on the front, scrawled in loopy ink. For the cobbler. Tobias opened the window slowly. The night air curled in, full of moss and chimney smoke and moonlight. The cat was already gone, leaving nothing but a few black hairs and the sense that he'd just been silently judged. He broke the seal with a hairpin and unfolded the letter. There was only one sentence, written in the same swooping ink. "I wish I could speak to my grandfather again." There was no name, no return address, no explanation. Tobias turned the paper over twice, as if expecting instructions to fall out. "Curious," he said aloud. The mice said nothing. He reread the line 3 more times. There was something about it, something unusually earnest. It wasn't the sort of thing a child would write as a game or an adult as a prank. This was a real wish. Someone had written it down and trusted it to, what? A cat? He set the letter beside his tea and tried to get back to his work. But the wish nestled itself in his thoughts like a pebble in a boot, small but insistent. "I wish I could speak to my grandfather again." That night, Tobias dreamed of shoes that whispered and lanterns that ticked like clocks. The next morning, Tobias stood outside the stone-walled cemetery near the edge of the village, watching fog twist around the gravestones. He had brought with him a screwdriver, a spool of copper wire, and a small, dented radio he'd found in the back room of his shop 6 years ago and never managed to throw away. It had occurred to him at breakfast that a conversation didn't always need 2 living people. Sometimes what mattered most was the saying, not the hearing. He chose a bench just near the older graves, one so weathered that names had faded into lichen. With careful hands, he opened the back of the radio and began wiring the copper in loops. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing, but something in him said this is the way. The radio crackled once, then whined softly, like a voice trying to remember its shape. He turned the dial. Static. Then, just for a moment, a low hum. He propped the letter against the stone nearest the bench, folded into a little triangle. "Just in case," he muttered, and gave the radio one final pat. Then he sat waiting, not for a ghost or a sign, but for a sense that the wish had been heard. Over the next few days, strange things happened. Mrs. Tilbury, who ran the flower stall and never smiled at anyone under 70, was seen laughing, with a little boy near the bakery. When asked what was so funny, she said, "He said his granddad told him that he still had jam on his chin." And he did. Old Bertie, the town handyman, started leaving benches with letters carved into them. "Talk more even when it's hard," read one. "He's proud of you," read another. And Tobias received no thank you, no sign, no letter, until the next full moon. The cat returned with a second letter. Same parchment, same red seal. This time the handwriting was different, rounder, younger. "I wish it would rain at the summer fete." Tobias looked up from the letter. The cat sat on his work table this time, licking a paw delicately, then glanced at him with a faintly smug expression, as if to say, "Well?" Tobias sighed, took off his glasses, and smiled to himself for the first time in what felt like years. "Very well, then," he said, setting the letter beside the first. He fetched his umbrella. Chapter 2. The Girl Who Wanted Rain. The summer fete in Larkspur Hollow was not just an event. It was an ordeal. Stalls unfurled like cheerful fungus along Clover Street. Bunting tangled itself in the sycamores, and children were turned loose with such abandon that even the sheep in nearby fields grew suspicious. Tobias Finch generally avoided the fete. Too many bright colors, too much shouting, and always someone asking whether he could make shoes for their goat. He had done it once as a joke. Never again. But now he stood in his workshop, holding a folded letter in one hand and staring thoughtfully out the window at a sky so bright it made the pavement squint. The clouds had gone on holiday. The sun was smug. The air shimmered. "I wish it would rain at the summer fete," the letter read. It didn't say why. There was no signature, just the small, round script of someone who dotted their I's with effort. Tobias sat on his stool, turning the letter over and over. Rain during the fete would upset half the village. The cake tent would collapse. Mrs. Dursey's jam might melt. The Morris dancers would slip on their bells. It would be chaos, which perhaps was the point. On Monday, Tobias walked to the village library and made a very specific request of the librarian, Mrs. Ferndale, who wore scarves like battle armor and catalogued overdue books with the grim solemnity of a tax collector. "I need something on atmospheric manipulation," he said, in the same tone he might have used to ask for a book on making sensible boots for toads. Mrs. Ferndale raised an eyebrow so high it nearly joined her fringe. "Raining spells?" she asked. "You'll be wanting mildly disruptive weather for beginners, or possibly the Practical Cloud Enthusiast's Almanac." She pulled down both without further comment, added a third with a wink, rainmaking for the romantically desperate, and sent him on his way. Back in his workshop, Tobias laid out his supplies. A broken umbrella, a length of copper tubing, a handful of hollow acorns, and a tin watering can with a dent shaped suspiciously like the continent of Australia. He read, sketched, muttered, and built. He called it the Rain Wish Engine. It looked, to any reasonable person, like a glorified scarecrow stuck in a wheelbarrow. But to the keenly magical, or perhaps to those very young, it was full of promise. The umbrella spun gently when wound. The acorns rattled like clouds considering themselves. And when Tobias whispered the words, "Cloudfall where none dare fall," a line he'd found in a poem wedged between pages of the almanac, the whole thing gave off a soft, damp shimmer. He wheeled it into the village square on the morning of the fete and left it beneath a sycamore with a sign that read, "Wishing for rain, please do not feed the machine." People gave it wide berth, as they tended to do with anything Tobias made that wasn't boots. The fete began. Children raced past with sticky faces. There were jugglers and pies and a very ill-conceived tug-of-war across the duck pond. The sun loomed overhead, proud and merciless. Tobias waited. Nothing. The rain-wish engine creaked a little, then sighed. The umbrella spun lazily. And then, just as Mrs. Dursey took first place in the sponge cake competition and held the trophy aloft, it began to rain. Not a drizzle, not a storm, a friendly sort of rain, cool, clean, the kind that smells like new leaves and summer endings. People shouted. Children squealed. Cakes were rushed under tents. Musicians played faster. The Morris dancers jingled in disarray. But over by the acorn-studded machine, a girl stood still. She had frizzy red hair, a lopsided hat, and muddy knees. In one hand, she held a small potted plant. In the other, a folded letter. She looked at Tobias, then at the sky, then back. "You made it rain," she said, not accusing, astonished. Tobias, damp around the edges, gave a small nod. "I had help." The cat, sitting on the sycamore branch above, blinked slowly. The girl held out the plant. It was scraggly, a little wilted, but clinging on. "It's mint," she said, "but it kept drying out. My wish was for it to grow. I didn't know how else to make that happen, so I wrote it down. I didn't think anyone would read it." Tobias crouched beside her. "Well, sometimes the world listens better when you ask out loud." She beamed, and suddenly Tobias saw freckles where raindrops had landed. "You should come by next week," he added. "If the mint perks up, I've got an old jar on my windowsill. Might like some company." The girl nodded solemnly. "I'm Pip," she said. "Short for Persephone, but only my grandmother calls me that." "Tobias," said Tobias. "Short for Tobias." That evening, after the fete had been cleared away, and soggy bunting coiled in gutters, and every last drop of rain had curled back into the clouds, Tobias found a note waiting for him on his workbench. It wasn't from Pip. It was from the cat. Or rather, the cat had delivered it. No seal this time, just a scrap of folded parchment, resting atop his tools. The handwriting was neat, firm. "I wish I could find the path we walked when I was young." No name. Tobias set the letter down beside the others. The cat leapt silently to the windowsill, tail curling like a question mark. It paused, blinked once at Tobias, and disappeared into the moonlight. The wishes, it seemed, would keep coming. And Tobias Finch, cobbler of Clover Street, was no longer just a maker of shoes. He was a mender of impossible things. Chapter 3: The Mapmaker's Regret. The letter was thicker than the others, folded with precision, creased so neatly Tobias suspected it had been held and refolded many times before being entrusted to the cat. "I wish I could find the path we walked when I was young." No name, no hint, just the ache of longing pressed into each word. Tobias ran his thumb along the paper's edge. The others had been direct. Speak to a grandfather, bring rain. This one shimmered with uncertainty. The path we walked. Who was we? Where had the path gone? Outside, the cat slept on a half-finished hiking boot, its tail flicking against Tobias's scribbled notes. He looked down at his own feet, worn leather slippers dusted with wool threads. "I suppose you'd like me to go wandering again," he muttered. The cat opened one eye and sneezed delicately in reply. The next morning, Tobias walked to the village green, where an old man was setting up a telescope, an odd thing to do in full daylight, but not altogether strange for Larkspur Hollow. The man was Oswin Bramble, retired mapmaker, legendary for his rambling stories and his habit of measuring everything twice, and drawing it once, always slightly off. "Morning, Mr. Finch," said Oswin, peering at Tobias over a lens cap. "Shoes holding up well?" "They're yours, Oswin," Tobias reminded him. "You bought them from me last year." "Ah, that explains the left heel being kinder than the right." Oswin chuckled, then returned to fiddling with his brass dials. Out for a stroll? Looking for a path, Tobias said carefully. One that may have vanished. Oswin froze. Slowly he turned. What sort of path? Tobias pulled out the letter. He didn't hand it over, just read it aloud. Oswin's hands stilled. I walked one like that, the old man said at last. When I was a boy, it cut through the meadows behind Farley's orchard, led to a ridge with a stone that hummed when the wind blew right. My sister and I used to pretend it led to the stars. He looked down. Haven't found it in 50 years. Did you ever map it? Tobias asked. Course I did, said Oswin. Twice. It moved both times. By afternoon, Tobias had borrowed Oswin's earliest maps and made tea for 3. Himself, Oswin, and the cat, who preferred milk and drank it with a look of practiced dignity. The maps were beautiful things, hand-inked on vellum and speckled with scribbled notes. Cow with odd temperament here, beetle stones, approach with reverence, and near the top corner, written in tiny script, the path appears only if you are not looking. Tobias stared at that line for some time. Then he packed bread, string, and a pair of walking shoes with ivy-stitched soles, and set out just before dusk. Behind Farley's orchard, the land opened into soft, looping hills. Tobias let his steps meander. He didn't search. He didn't squint. He just walked, letting his feet follow a rhythm older than memory. It was nearly dark when he felt it. A shift beneath his heels. The grass flattened a little differently. The breeze changed tune. He looked down. There, winding between tufts of wild carrot and dandelion clocks, was a path. Not dirt, not stone, but something subtler. A line of flattened clover, silver in moonlight. It led into a grove of hazel trees, half swallowed by time. He followed. The path wove like a dream, looping through mossy hollows and soft hillsides. At its end stood a boulder covered in lichen. On its surface were carvings, worn, barely visible, but Tobias could feel them under his fingers. Stars, spirals, compass rose. When the wind moved, the stone hummed. Tobias sat beside it and waited, not for someone, for the wish. Oswin's words echoed. My sister and I used to pretend it led to the stars. The old mapmaker had written the wish. Tobias was sure now. He closed his eyes and pictured 2 children, running hand in hand. Laughter in tall grass. The path not as escape, but as promise. He left behind a gift. A new pair of boots, designed for wandering. On the soles, he'd stitched the map of the path in invisible thread, activated only by moonlight. 2 days later, Tobias passed Oswin in the market square. Walked that path, the old man murmured, eyes damp. Boots fit perfectly. Took me right there. Thought it might be gone or I had dreamed it. But no, still there, still waiting. He clutched a folded map in one hand. Found this in the grove. Don't know how. Thought you might want it. Tobias took it and unfolded it carefully. It was a map of Larkspur Hollow, but different. The houses had soft edges. The hills curled like question marks. The cobbler's shop had a little note beside it. Where wishes are mended. Tobias smiled. I didn't draw this. Nor did I, said Oswin. They both looked around. The cat sat on a wall, licking its paw like nothing at all had happened. That evening, the cat delivered another letter. The paper was folded into the shape of a bird. Tobias unfolded it gently. Inside was a single wish, written in a shaky but elegant hand. I wish I could sing again. He placed it beside the others, already thinking of feathers and phonographs and echoes. Outside, the moon rose with a purr of silver light. Chapter 4, The Chimney Sweep Song. The letter had been folded with a kind of aching care. Not sharply, like the mapmaker's, nor playfully, like the bird-shaped one before. This one was folded slowly, hesitantly, and then smoothed as if the sender had changed their mind before posting it. Tobias found it beside a stack of shoehorns early one morning, nestled between a spool of thread and the cat's curled tail. The ink was thin, the handwriting tall and trembly. "I wish I could sing again." He read it twice. The word again clung like mist. Not a child's wish to begin singing, nor the boastful ambition of a festival hopeful. This was a wish of loss, someone who once had a voice and no longer did. But why? And who? He looked down at the cat. It blinked back, yawned, and turned to wash its back leg with disinterest. Tobias had long since learned not to expect answers from it, only better questions. He began, as always, by walking. Larkspur Hollow was a small place, but it had corners where stories collected. The bell tower, the dry fountain, the bakery's attic. If you listened carefully, the walls had seams, and some of them whispered. That morning, the whisper came from the rooftop of Mayhew's sweet shop. Tobias had stopped beneath the crooked eaves to tighten his bootlaces when he heard it. A low, rhythmic scraping, like a broom brushing stone. He looked up. A man in a soot-streaked cap crouched near a chimney. He moved with the confidence of someone used to sloped surfaces. In his hands, a long-handled sweep brush and a satchel slung tight to his back. His clothes were all ash and threadbare denim, and around his neck hung a scarf with tiny embroidered sparrows. He was humming, but without sound. No tune, no whistle, just the open shape of a song on his lips. When he looked down and spotted Tobias, he startled. Tobias raised a hand. "Didn't mean to scare you, just admiring your balance." The man smiled, then touched 2 fingers to his throat and shook his head. Mute. Tobias's heart quickened. They met later in the workshop. The man, whose name was Bram, wrote on Tobias's chalkboard in precise, left-slanted letters. "I used to sing. Lost it 3 winters ago. Fever took my voice." He wiped the chalk with the edge of his scarf. Then, hesitating, added, "But sometimes I still feel the notes, like they're stuck in my ribs." Tobias, stirred by a warmth he couldn't explain, made tea. "I received a wish," he said aloud, "from someone who wants to sing again. I think it was you." Bram didn't reply. He just blinked, then looked down at his hands. Tobias stood, went to a cabinet, and returned with a battered phonograph wrapped in string. "I have an idea," he said. The next few days were filled with experimentation. Tobias built something odd and unwieldy. Part music box, part chimney brush, part bellows. At its heart was the phonograph, fitted with a copper funnel and feather-thin wire threads that could carry sound like a web carries wind. The idea was simple, if not logical. Catch the memory of Bram's voice from before it vanished. Let the machine hum back what he could no longer speak. They tried recording the scrape of brushes, the tap of boots, the breath of wind through chimneys. Tobias mixed them like ingredients in a stew, fine-tuning pitch and tone until the machine emitted a curious warble. Not quite human, not quite mechanical. But when Bram touched the rim of the funnel and hummed, silently, the box trembled and sang. The voice that came from the machine was ghost-like but unmistakable. Deep, steady, rough in a warm kind of way. A voice like firewood and gravel, like winter soup and velvet shadows. Bram sat frozen. Then he laughed. A wheezing, breathy laugh with no sound but bright, alive eyes. Tobias added a crank, a leather strap, and a string of tiny brass chimes. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it was something. That evening, as the moon crept up behind the chapel spire, Bram took the music box onto the market green. He turned the crank. Out came the song. A lullaby old and soft, in a language that didn't quite exist anymore. The villagers fell still. One child pointed up at the rooftops, eyes wide. "It's the sweep," she whispered. "He's singing." And indeed, Bram was, face lifted to the stars, mouth shaping notes no one could hear, hands steady on the crank as his lost voice spilled from the machine like dream sap. Afterwards, he returned the box to Tobias. "It's yours," Tobias said. "You'll need it more than me." Bram hesitated. Then he wrote, "Let me sweep your chimney. Consider it a trade." Tobias laughed, despite himself. Deal. The next morning, he woke to find his chimney spotless and a fresh bundle of mint tied to the handle of his front door. That night, the cat returned. It placed a letter squarely on Tobias's pillow and stepped daintily on his nose before leaping out the open window. The letter was tiny, and the handwriting barely legible. It looked like it had been written in the dark, or by someone and used to words. I wish I could disappear. Tobias sat up slowly. Not because the wish was strange, but because it was far too familiar. He'd made it once himself. A long time ago. He tucked the letter beneath the others and didn't sleep for hours. Chapter 5: The Woman Who Wished to Be Forgotten. The letter sat on Tobias's workbench like a shadow that didn't belong to anything in the room. I wish I could disappear. He'd read it 6 times by breakfast. Each time it felt different, sadder, heavier, like someone whispering from a deep, dark cupboard they'd locked themselves inside. The cat sat beside the kettle, tail curled like a question mark, and for once it didn't blink at him. It just watched. Tobias knew better than to ignore the weight of a wish like this. And so he closed his workshop early, put on his oldest boots, the ones that had never let him down, and began to wander. He started with the post office. Mrs. Doran, the village postmistress, had seen every face in Larkspur Hollow at least once a month and had the memory of a magpie. She was a master of knowing things she hadn't been told. I'm looking for someone, Tobias said quietly. Someone who might be trying not to be found. Mrs. Doran sniffed, stirred her tea, and looked over her glasses. You want the baker's cousin. Moved into the flat behind the old blacksmith's last spring. Quiet as a candle. Never shops during daylight. No name on the door. But she bakes the best rye biscuits I've ever tasted. And that's saying something. Tobias nodded. Thank you. Do try not to scare her off, she added. The last person who knocked on her door got a boot thrown at them. And it wasn't even one of yours. The flat behind the blacksmith shop looked abandoned. Dust on the windows, ivy curling into the doorframe. A crooked sign that once said, Tinsmith, now read, Innsmouth. Tobias knocked anyway. There was a long silence. Then, a voice sharp, older than he expected. Unless you're the moon or someone holding cake, kindly go away. I'm not the moon, said Tobias. But I might be someone holding a letter. The door cracked open. A pair of eyes peered out. Gray, sharp, rimmed with caution. You're the cobbler. I am. You make things happen. He didn't answer, just held out the letter. She snatched it from his hand, read it, and slowly opened the door. Her name was Etta. She wore 2 cardigans layered over a flower-streaked apron and had hair like a pile of dandelion fluff determined not to cooperate. Her flat smelled of rye, anise, and something just slightly bitter, like burnt sugar or stubborn memory. I didn't think the cat would deliver it, she said, pouring him tea without asking. It's not the sort of wish that helps anyone. That's not true, Tobias replied gently. Wanting to vanish is often a sign you've been seen too harshly. Etta grunted. I was seen. That was the problem. Over cracked china cups, she told him the story. 10 years ago, she'd owned a bakery in a neighboring town. It had done well until someone accused her of stealing a recipe. Not just any recipe. A prized ginger tart that had won the village's summer sweet-off 3 years running. The accusation was absurd. The recipe had been her grandmother's. But the damage was done. Customers vanished. Whispers started. Friends stepped back, quiet and guilty. Etta closed the shop and vanished, too. She hadn't spoken to anyone who knew her real name since. I thought if I stayed quiet enough, long enough, I'd just fade. Tobias stirred his tea. Would you want people to forget everything? Or just the parts that hurt? Etta didn't answer, but her hands trembled. Over the next week, Tobias built something strange. Not shoes this time, not a machine. A door. Or rather, a doorway frame, freestanding, made of wood salvaged from a bakery oven and an old church pew. In its lintel, he carved words Etta had once whispered in her sleep. Not gone, just waiting to be seen kindly. He set it up in the square one morning without explanation. A few villagers wandered through it. Nothing happened, but those who knew Etta and had known her before paused. Mrs. Doran, the old vicar, a girl who used to visit the bakery every Thursday with her pocket money. Each time someone passed beneath the arch, something shifted. They blinked, tilted their heads, and remembered her. Not the whispers, not the scandal, but her laugh, her biscuits, her warm apron. By the next full moon, the flat behind the blacksmith's had a painted sign. Etta's oven biscuits, bread, and brave returns. People came, slowly at first, then with baskets, then with stories. No one mentioned the past. Not even Etta. But Tobias saw her watching them with damp eyes and steady hands. I didn't disappear, she said one day, as he bought a sourdough roll the size of his head. I just became quiet enough to be rediscovered. Tobias smiled. Sometimes that's all it takes. That evening the cat returned. No letter, just a single red thread in its mouth, which it dropped onto Tobias's pillow before curling up like a comma. Tobias picked up the thread. It glowed faintly, pulsed like a heartbeat, then curled into the shape of a musical note. He stared. Then, from somewhere deep in memory, a scent surfaced. Lemon oil, and a hand, warm and calloused, tugging gently at his collar. A woman's voice, laughing. He set the thread aside. He wasn't ready. Not yet. The cat blinked once and looked away. Then, as if giving him a breath to catch up, the next full moon brought a far simpler letter. Folded like a paper kite, sealed with a berry-smudged fingerprint. The handwriting was messy, like someone trying to write while bouncing on a trampoline. I wish I could be older. 10 is far too small to do anything. Tobias exhaled, relieved, amused, and only slightly worried. Older, is it? He murmured. Well, let's see what we can do about that. Chapter 6, The Clock That Ticked Backwards. The wish came in a letter that smelled faintly of raspberry jam and pencil shavings. I wish I could be older. 10 is far too small to do anything. Milo R. It was written in chunky, determined print, with several eraser smudges and a doodle of a rocket in the corner. The paper had been folded into a wonky triangle, as if meant for a paper plane, and it came tied with a shoelace instead of ribbon. The cat delivered it by dropping it directly onto Tobias's head while he was trimming a pair of worn sandals. Right, Tobias said, unfolding it carefully. Let's see what small wants to become big. Milo lived at the edge of the village, in a leaning house covered in ivy and half-mended gutters. He shared it with his grandfather, an old woodworker who spent most of his days whistling through his teeth and carving birds that never flew. The boy was outside when Tobias arrived, lying on the grass with his legs in the air, examining the sky like it was a blueprint. You must be the shoemaker, Milo said, without looking. Tobias nodded. You must be the boy who wants to be old. Older, Milo corrected. Not old. I've met old. Old creaks and falls asleep in the middle of stories. And why do you want to be older? Because no one listens to small things. I have plans. I'm going to build a machine that flies and collects raindrops and tells bees where to go in winter. But they all think I'm too little. He made quotation marks in the air, clearly irritated. Tobias smiled. Well, I've known plenty of tall people who've never had an idea that clever. Over tea and blueberry muffins, Milo ate 3. Tobias asked to see the machine. It turned out to be a wild patchwork of gears, buttons, old alarm clocks, and a coiled spring from a rocking chair. The contraption lived in the shed behind the house and buzzed faintly like it was trying to think. It's not ready yet, Milo said, petting it like a cat. But when it is, you'll see. Everyone will see. Tobias examined the jumble and saw something better than readiness. He saw wonder, an effort, and pure, delightful nonsense that might just become brilliance. You don't need to be older, he said gently. You just need someone to listen. That night, Tobias worked late. He repurposed an old grandfather clock from the back room, hollowed out its insides, and laced it with chimes, hinges, mirrors, and one small brass bell that only rang when someone said, "Impossible." He carved a phrase along its pendulum. Time doesn't measure cleverness. Then he built a pair of boots, one size too big, but with adjustable soles and pockets in the heels. They had a compass in one toe, a pencil in the other, and a tiny notebook tucked inside the tongue. He delivered both just before dawn. Milo found the gifts and let out a whoop so loud it scared 3 birds out of the hedges. The boots made him 3 inches taller. The clock, which he lugged into the living room and declared his laboratory heart, ticked backwards and forwards depending on whether you asked it a question or told it a fact. That afternoon, Milo stood in the village square in his new boots beside his ticking invention and explained the mechanics of communication to a crowd of 6 mildly confused but utterly charmed adults. No one interrupted. No one told him he was small. A week later, Mrs. Delphi from the school offered him a workshop corner with spare parts and a magnifying lamp. Mr. Finch, the beekeeper, invited him to test his theories in the apiary. Even Etta sent over cinnamon buns labeled, "For the tall mind." Milo was still 10, but he didn't feel small anymore. As Tobias passed by the shed one morning, he noticed a new message etched into the door. "Big ideas live here. Please knock." And beneath that, in smaller script, "But not if you're going to tell me it won't work." That evening, the cat returned. It sat atop the workbench with a smug expression and dropped 2 letters at once. One was folded neatly, sealed with green wax and the scent of mint. The other was scribbled hastily on graph paper, tucked into a pouch sewn from velvet and old buttons. Tobias raised an eyebrow. "Double wish night?" The cat stretched, yawned, and flicked its tail. The first letter read, "I wish I could hear her voice again. See." And the second, "I wish I'd never let him go." Tobias held them both for a long time, the evening light catching in the threads of his cuffs. Regret, he thought. Regret is the older sibling of wishing. The cat looked at him, unblinking. "Well," Tobias murmured, brushing flour dust from the edge of the first note, "I suppose I'd better begin." Chapter 7, The Voice in the Music Box. The letter was sealed with mint green wax and signed only with the initial C. The handwriting was tidy but faint, as though written by someone afraid the page might bruise. "I wish I could hear her voice again. C." Tobias read it 3 times. Some wishes told him exactly what to do. Patch a roof, mend a heart, deliver muffins to a secret picnic. But this one didn't tell him what kind of voice, or how long it had been silent, or why it mattered so deeply that it made its way into a cat's velvet pouch. The black cat, lounging by the fire, gave a soft trill. Tobias tucked the note into his apron and began walking. The address led him to the 2nd floor of a shop called Feathers and Thread, which sold needlepoint kits, cloud-colored yarn, and buttons shaped like animals and hats. The apartment above smelled of dried lavender and rain-damp quilts. A woman opened the door slowly. "Are you the cobbler?" she asked, her voice barely louder than the breeze. "I am," Tobias said, smiling. "Are you the wisher?" She nodded and stepped aside, motioning him in with one hand while the other gripped a cane carved like a spiral staircase. She was in her 70s, perhaps older. Her silver braid was pinned with a brooch shaped like a swallow. She wore 3 cardigans at once, and each one looked like it had a memory sewn into the sleeves. "My name's Clara," she said. "Would you like tea?" Tobias nodded. "Always." They sat among cushions and teacups painted with violets. The walls were covered in portraits, most of them stitched, some painted, all of them warm-eyed and smiling. There was a photograph, too. A younger Clara with a girl about 10, both laughing in the middle of a windy field. "My granddaughter," Clara said, her thumb resting against the frame. "Lyra." She looks like she had a laugh that could knock over furniture, Tobias said. Clara chuckled, though her eyes watered. She did. She could laugh even when she was furious, especially when she was furious. The room held a kind of reverence, like a hush after a song. Clara set her cup down. She died 3 years ago. A sudden thing. Heart. No warnings. No time. Tobias bowed his head slightly. I'm so sorry. Clara nodded. I don't want her back. That's not the wish. I know where she is. I know she's not hurting. But her voice. She closed her eyes. I keep forgetting what it sounded like. It's slipping from me, and I'm afraid it'll vanish altogether. I just want to hear her again. Even once. Tobias spent the afternoon listening. Clara told stories. Not dramatic ones. Just the little moments stitched together like her embroidery. Lyra narrating bedtime stories in silly accents. Lyra singing songs she made up about sandwiches. Lyra trying to teach the cat French. She always hummed when she concentrated, Clara said, smiling. Always. Even when she was angry. That hum. Tobias left just before sunset. He'd taken notes. He'd taken something else, too. An old music box that no longer played and a button from Lyra's favorite coat. Clara pressed it into his hand without speaking. For 3 days, Tobias worked. He dismantled the music box and rewired the comb so that it rang in different tones. Some soft, some defiant, one note that didn't belong to any scale but felt like laughter with sharp edges. He layered gears with wind chime glass and fed the button into the mechanism's core, wrapping it with a ribbon from the letter. But it wasn't enough. He needed something else. Not just sound, but presence. So he visited the town's library, where Lyra once read to children on Saturday mornings. He asked the librarian for an old cassette from the Story Hour archives. After much rummaging, they found one. It was dusty and unmarked, but when Tobias played it, there she was, Lyra reading The Mouse Who Lost His Map in 5 different voices, each more ridiculous than the last. The laughter in the background belonged to children, and somewhere beneath it all, a quiet humming. He took the tape home and worked through the night. Clara opened the parcel on her birthday. Inside was the music box, polished and smooth, but instead of winding with a key, it opened when held tightly, as if drawing strength from hands that remembered. She pressed her palm to the lid. The mechanism ticked softly, then hummed. A warm voice filled the room, clear and young and mischievous. You're holding this box because you love me, and I'm not gone, not really. I'm in the humming. I'm in the way you say my name when no one's around. I'm in the smell of strawberries and old books and that time we laughed about the pigeon with the crooked foot. Remember? I'm still here. Close your eyes and listen. It wasn't a perfect replica, but it was full of the right spirit. Clara listened, cried, laughed, and then hummed along. That night, the black cat curled up beside Tobias's boots and purred loud enough to rattle a mug on the shelf. Tobias poured a cup of rosehip tea and unwrapped the second letter, the one scribbled on graph paper. I wish I'd never let him go. The cat tapped the note twice with its paw, as if to say, this one will ache. Tobias nodded. I know. He set the letter gently beside the kettle. Then he opened his old box of maps, the ones people sent him in lieu of thank yous, with dotted trails of memory, stitched paths of kindness, and marked spots of dreams made real. He began looking for S. Chapter 8, The Wish Left Unsent. The letter was unusual from the start. It wasn't tied with ribbon or sealed with wax. It wasn't even folded neatly. The page looked like it had been crumpled in a fist for days before the sender finally let it go. It read in small, hesitant script. I wish I'd never let him go to us. No address, no name, no return mark of any kind. The black cat stared at it as if waiting for something more to appear. Tobias turned it over. Then again. A whisper of dust fell from the creases, but there was nothing else. Well, Tobias said, we'll just have to follow the wish, not the paper. The cat meowed softly, then leapt up to the windowsill to watch the moon. Tobias spent the next day talking to the town. He took the letter to the postmistress, Madame Bellamy, who frowned at the paper like it had committed a crime. "This came through me?" she asked. "I'm not sure," Tobias admitted. "It arrived with the cat." Madame Bellamy sniffed. "Well, the cat doesn't pay postage." But after some coaxing and a small tin of lemon biscuits, she opened the register and searched through old outgoing letters, sorting by first initials. "S," she murmured, flipping through the pages. "Sophie? No. Samuel? No." Finally, she landed on one, Simon Devane. Posted letters to Paris, then Berlin, then nothing for 6 years. She paused. Left town around the time of the festival fire. Tobias remembered it. A lantern tipped too soon during the midsummer parade. No one had died, but a whole row of stalls was lost, and one of the dancers had vanished soon after. A boy with black boots and a fiddle case. Tobias had mended those boots once. He found Simon in the hills. Not by name, no. Tobias asked around for a man who once played music that made dogs cry and trees lean a little closer. "Ah," said a shepherd, "the fiddler who lives by the windmill." Simon's cottage was overgrown and quiet. Moss covered the path and ivy draped the windows like shy curtains. A faint melody floated from within. An old folk tune that sounded both hopeful and bruised. Tobias knocked. The man who answered had kind eyes and tangled hair, and when Tobias handed him the crumpled letter, he sat down on the porch without a word. "I didn't send it," Simon said after a long pause. "I wrote it, carried it in my pocket for months. Then I tossed it in the river." Tobias tilted his head. "And yet it came to me." Simon smiled wryly. "Perhaps the river listens better than I do." The story was not dramatic, not really, just quiet and sad. Simon had fallen in love with a boy named Eli, a baker's apprentice who sang to the dough and wore his aprons like armor. They'd met during a spring fair. They spent 2 summers together, laughing too loudly, kissing behind the honey stall, playing music in empty churches after midnight. But when the fire came, and blame started to scatter like ash, Simon had panicked. His fiddle was blamed for the spark. He was accused, then cleared, but not before someone carved liar into his market cart. He left the next morning, didn't say goodbye. "I thought I was protecting him," Simon said. "From me, from the town, from what they thought. And now?" Tobias asked. Simon looked out at the hills. "Now I just want to know what I cost him." Tobias returned to town and visited the bakery. It had changed names. Now it was Thistle and Cinnamon, run by a round-faced woman with cinnamon freckles and the energy of a fireworks show. But she remembered Eli. Quiet fellow, sweet, but with a sadness that clung to him like flower. She leaned closer. He left too, a few months after the fire, moved to the coast. Heard he opened a sea-facing patisserie. Tobias thanked her and walked straight to the maps. By sunset, he had found the town. The train to Brise de Lune took 6 hours, a ferry, and 1 broken shoelace. The patisserie sat on a windy bluff, its door painted periwinkle and its sign a swirl of sugar and stars. Inside, the air smelled like lemon glaze and longing. Eli was there, older, still beautiful, his hands flour-dusted, his hair streaked with gray. Tobias bought a tart, then quietly asked, "Did you ever know someone named Simon Devane?" The name made Eli freeze. "I did," he said softly. "Long ago." Tobias hesitated. "Would you like to know what he wished?" Eli looked down at the tart, then back at Tobias. "Please." Tobias handed him a copy of the note. "I wish I'd never let him go. S." Eli read it once, then again. His throat moved like he was swallowing a world of words. "Why now?" he whispered. Tobias smiled. "Because someone finally decided to listen to the river." They met again at dusk. Simon sat on the edge of the cliff, fiddle in hand, playing the tune that once made trees sigh. Eli walked toward him slowly, holding 2 mugs of tea. They didn't speak right away. But then Simon said, "I kept your scarf. It still smells like almonds." Eli laughed. "Just a little. You still drink tea too hot and burn your tongue." "I do." And just like that, the 6-year ache loosened. Tobias left them to their mending and walked along the beach, boots crunching through shells. The tide was low, and he saw something glinting in the sand. It was a message in a bottle. Inside, a single piece of parchment, neatly folded. "I wish I hadn't hidden who I am." Back in his cottage, the black cat sniffed the bottle, then sat on it like it belonged to her. "I suppose we're headed underwater next," Tobias said. The cat mewed, then leapt to the windowsill. Chapter 9: The Mermaid's Mirror. The bottle had dried by morning. Its cork sat beside the sink like a half-finished thought, and the parchment inside, still crisp and cream-colored, unfolded itself easily in Tobias's hands. "I wish I hadn't hidden who I am. There was something raw about this one, like a half-carved shape still shedding splinters. Tobias didn't know anyone in town who signed their name with just an L, but the sea did, and so did the cat. That morning, the black cat led him not toward the market square or the forest path, but down through the winding alleys behind the bellmaker's shop, past the old salt house and its ruined chimney, past the moss-covered seawall with the faded sign. Bathers discouraged past this point. She hopped onto a half-buried crate, tail flicking toward a sea cave exposed only during the lowest tides. Tobias followed her inside. The sea cave was not empty. It was filled with mirrors, some polished, some cracked, some barely reflective, hung on walls, resting on stones, leaning precariously on driftwood planks. Every shape imaginable: oval, star, heart, sunburst. Some bore inscriptions. One read for seeing clearly, another read for seeing backwards, a third, faint and almost erased, read for seeing whole. Tobias's breath misted in the air, though the cave was not cold. A voice echoed faintly behind him. "You shouldn't be here unless you're ready." He turned. A figure stood at the back of the cave, between 2 wide gilt-framed mirrors. Neither reflected them. They wore a long coat of sealskin and salt-soaked lace, and their hair shimmered like wet seaweed. Their eyes were dark and luminous, like the surface of deep water before a storm. "You brought the wish," they said, nodding toward the bottle tucked beneath Tobias's arm. "And the cat brought you." Tobias took a cautious step forward. "Are you L?" A small smile. "No, but I know who is." Their name was Lorien, and they lived neither above the waves nor entirely below. They were a mirror keeper of a sort. "Mirrors have memory," Lorien said. "They reflect what is, what was, what might be if you know how to look. Most don't." They explained that many came to the cave over the years, seeking to see something they'd lost. A child grown, a face they used to wear, a life unlived, but not all left unchanged. And once, not long ago, someone came with a wish they couldn't speak aloud. "They left behind their reflection," Lorien said, "and in doing so, gave up more than they understood." Tobias furrowed his brow. "Can I speak with them?" Lorien nodded. "If you're willing to see." The mirror was tall, thin, and rippled faintly like water disturbed by song. Lorien whispered a phrase in a language Tobias didn't know but understood all the same. The surface shifted, and there they were, a young person with a storm in their posture and eyes full of questions, standing on the edge of the pier, facing away from the sea, dressed like someone else's idea of them, holding a letter they never mailed. They turned and looked directly at Tobias. It wasn't a trick of the mirror. This was no passive image. "You have my wish," they said quietly. "Did you read it?" Tobias nodded. "I wish I hadn't hidden who I am." The figure nodded back. "I wrote it before I even had the words, before I knew what it meant." Their name was Lark. They had grown up in a house with narrow rules and ironed collars. Their laughter had been too loud, their steps too soft, their dreams too unexplainable. They learned early to fold themselves into what others expected. But inside, they'd always known. "I'm not what they wanted," Lark said. "And for a long time, I thought that meant I wasn't anything at all." Tobias swallowed gently. "So you came here?" Lark smiled sadly. "To see myself, just once, without anyone else's gaze getting in the way." Lorien explained that Lark had not been able to bear the sight of their full self. Not yet. They had asked the mirror to hide their truth until they were ready. "And are you?" Tobias asked softly, turning to Lark. There was a long silence. "I don't know," they said, "but I think I'd like to try." Lorien reached for a small mirror with a handle shaped like a kelp frond. They handed it to Tobias. "This was theirs," they said. "Give it back." And with it, their face. The mirror shimmered, showing only mist. Tobias tucked it carefully into his satchel and stepped back into the sunlight. Lark lived now at the edge of the salt marshes, in a cabin made of driftwood and painted in wide strokes of sea glass green. They kept bees and wove nets and wore clothing stitched from old sails and dyed with petals. They opened the door when Tobias knocked, expression cautious but curious. "I brought something," he said. He handed them the mirror. First, it showed nothing. Then, slowly, it began to glow. Lark stared into it for a long, unbroken moment. Their mouth parted. Their shoulders lowered. Their chest rose with a breath that seemed to go on forever. "It's me," they whispered. Finally. They didn't cry, not exactly, but a kind of rain filled the room anyway, one that had waited years to fall. Tobias offered no words, only tea and time. When Lark finally spoke, it was with a voice like a tide just beginning to turn. "I want to make a new wish," they scribbled on a fresh slip of paper. "I wish to live as I am, no longer hidden." Lark. They tied it with a ribbon the color of dusk and handed it to Tobias. "For the next full moon," they said. The black cat, who had been curled around Tobias's ankles this whole time, purred and flicked her tail. That evening, Tobias sat on his workshop stoop, the mirror from the cave beside him, reflecting the stars. He thought of all the people he'd helped, without fanfare, without magic wands, without fixing their lives entirely, just nudging them toward their truest selves. It was a quiet kind of kindness, the kind that could unmake old aches. He looked at the moon, then at the cat, who stared up at him with knowing eyes. "Who's next?" he asked. She pawed at his satchel, and out slipped a letter with golden ink. "I wish I hadn't stolen the blue violin. E.B." Tobias raised an eyebrow. "Now that's a story." Chapter 10: The Stolen Note. The letter was short. "I wish I hadn't stolen the blue violin. E.B." The paper smelled faintly of old resin and elderflowers. There was a tiny smudge of blue ink in the bottom corner, as though the pen itself had been caught weeping. Tobias read it twice before folding it neatly and placing it beside his tea. The black cat stared at him, her tail swaying like a metronome. "Well," he said at last, "let's find the tune behind this one." The initials weren't much to go on. E.B. No first name, no address, no dramatic underlining. But the blue violin, that was unusual. There were no music shops in their little town anymore. The only violinist Tobias could recall was Miss Carraway, who'd once played in the garden square every Sunday until arthritis curled her fingers. "She always played a brown violin," Tobias murmured to himself, dusting his windowsill. The cat flicked her tail at his boot and trotted toward the eastern quarter, the part of town with the crumbling clock tower, ivy-choked walls, and the bakery that sold bread shaped like animals on market days. They stopped in front of a door Tobias had passed 100 times but never truly seen. Painted a deep navy, it bore a hand-carved plaque, "Elodie Bellamy, Instrument Restoration and Tea, E.B." Of course. Elodie Bellamy was not what Tobias expected. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and wore spectacles with round frames tinted lavender. Her hair was woven into dozens of braids, each threaded with glinting strands of silver wire. She looked like someone who could hear lies before they were spoken. The shop was a cacophony of strings, cases, broken bows, and polished brass horns arranged like a steampunk jungle. But what drew Tobias's eyes was the violin. Perched on a velvet-lined pedestal was a blue violin. It was the kind of blue you saw in dreams. Cobalt and dusk swirled together, with the faintest shimmer like dragonfly wings. It gleamed like it knew secrets. Elodie saw him staring and gave a soft, bitter smile. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, "and entirely undeserved." They sat over chamomile tea that smelled like rain-soaked pages. Elodie spoke slowly, like each word had to be filtered through memory first. She'd been 10 when she first saw the violin in her grandfather's attic. Wrapped in a faded green shawl, tucked behind a portrait of a woman no one could name. The moment she touched it, it had hummed under her fingers. "It wasn't just a violin," she said. "It was me in a way." Her grandfather had forbidden her from playing it, said it was too valuable, too old, too full of a history that wasn't hers. So she stole it, not in anger but in aching. She took it from its perch and snuck out to the meadows. She played for hours, every sound in her soul finding a home in those strings. And when she returned it days later, the bow slightly frayed, the bridge faintly worn, he knew. He never spoke to her again. He left the violin to a museum in his will. "But I took it back," she said, eyes fixed on her tea. "Years later, after he died, I found the museum, found the case, found the code to the vault. I left behind another violin, same shape, similar wood, but not ours. And I ran." She looked up at Tobias. "I've kept it here ever since. I swore I'd never play it again. Not after what it cost." Tobias said nothing for a while. He studied the room, the careful way Elodie had arranged the tools on her bench, the tiny scraps of music notation pinned to the wall, the dried flower tucked into the violin's case. "May I hear it?" he asked softly. Elodie blinked. "I haven't played it in 15 years. "Then let it speak. Just once more." She didn't hesitate. The bow slid across the strings with a sound like stars brushing against velvet. The first note trembled, and then steadied, blooming into something warm and aching. It was not a song. It was a story. Of a girl and a grandfather and a silence that grew too wide. Of love that curdled into distance. Of fingers that ached not from time, but from what was left unsaid. As she played, tears slid down Elodie's cheeks. She didn't wipe them away. When she stopped, Tobias whispered, "That wasn't theft. That was memory returning home." That evening, Tobias returned with something tucked under his coat. He'd stopped by Miss Carraway's. The old violinist now used a weathered walking stick and a magnifying glass, but her ears were sharp as ever. When he asked if she'd ever heard of Elodie's blue violin, she nodded once and said, "Bellamy's girl? Thought she had magic in her fingers. Shame what happened with that grandfather of hers." But he kept every letter she wrote him after. She handed Tobias a bundle of yellowed envelopes. Letters Elodie had mailed after the silence began. Apologies, confessions, songs. None returned, none acknowledged, but kept, treasured. He placed them on Elodie's counter. "They were never unread," he said. Elodie stared at the pile like it might vanish if she blinked. She picked one up, broke the brittle seal, and read the looping words in her younger hand. Then she did something unexpected. She lifted the blue violin and played again. Not a lament, but a lullaby. Later, under moonlight, Tobias and the cat watched from a rooftop as Elodie opened the window of her shop and set the violin on the sill. It glowed faintly. She tied a note to the scroll. "I wish to forgive what cannot be changed, and honor what still sings. Elodie Bellamy." The cat purred and pressed her head against Tobias's knee. "Was that the wish?" Tobias asked. Or the reply. The cat simply flicked her tail, and a new envelope appeared. I wish the stars would speak to me again. Tobias smiled. Then I suppose we'd best look up. Chapter 11, The Astronomer's Silence. The envelope arrived dusted with glitter. It wasn't actual glitter, but the paper shimmered faintly, like it had caught a few spare stars in its fibers. Even the ink had a silvery sheen, and the wax seal bore a tiny constellation, Orion, if Tobias wasn't mistaken. He unfolded the letter carefully. I wish the stars would speak to me again. The black cat gave a quiet, meaningful chirp. You know something, don't you? Tobias asked. She blinked once, solemnly, then leapt onto the windowsill and stared east, toward the hill behind the town. Beyond the school, beyond the bakeries and bell towers, where the night sky reigned undisturbed. There was a dome there, half swallowed by ivy and disrepair. The old observatory. Once, it had been a place of wonder, where local school children climbed narrow steps to peer at Jupiter's moons, and stargazers gathered with flasks of tea to listen to the quiet droning of a woman who knew every constellation like a lullaby. But the lights had been off for years now, the telescope long disused, the woman gone, or so Tobias thought. The cat led him straight to the door, which bore a sign in spidery, slanted handwriting. Not closed. Just quiet. Inside, the observatory was both chaotic and oddly delicate. Books and star charts were piled like sculptures. Lenses of varying sizes gleamed under dust. A tea kettle hummed on a hot plate, and a bowl of sugar cubes sat beneath a sheet of transparent plastic labeled Stardust. A woman in a thick-knit sweater and enormous round glasses emerged from behind the telescope. Her hair was pinned up with actual pencils, and her left sock had a constellation embroidered into it. Taurus, Tobias thought. You're not here to rob me, are you? She asked cheerfully. Tobias smiled. Not unless you keep wishes in your sugar bowl. Her expression flickered. I haven't wished for anything in a very long time, she said, except for the sky to talk back. Her name was Henrietta Bloom. Just Henri, she insisted. If the stars are listening. She was the town's last astronomer. For 20 years, she'd cataloged meteor showers, tracked the moon's path through heartbreak, and sent out a handwritten newsletter titled Midnight Matters. Once, children had gathered to hear her stories about the star that blinked out for a single night, or the constellation that only appeared when someone kissed in the old train tunnel. But the telescope had stopped turning. Not broken, just quiet. It was after Margot left, Henri said, pouring Tobias a cup of strong, fragrant tea. She was the one who believed in messages, said the stars spoke if you listened in the right way. Tobias stirred in a sugar cube. Did you believe her? Henri shrugged. I believe in gravity, in spectral lines, in magnetars. But her? She believed in longing. Margot had been a poet, not a public one. She scribbled sonnets on receipts and tucked haikus into Henry's coat pockets. She made up names for stars, ones not in the charts. This one's for when you miss someone and don't know why, she'd say. This one is shaped like your laugh. Henri had loved her in the only way she knew how, with precision. She'd tracked her moods like orbits, mapped her smiles like eclipses. And yet, one night, Margot simply left. No note, no trail. Only a poem, tucked into the eyepiece of the telescope. You searched for meaning in constellations, but I was always the space between them. I stopped looking up after that, Henri said, her voice thin as gossamer. The stars didn't answer. They only echoed. Tobias studied the room. The telescope carefully dusted. The new moon chart scratched into the wall. The kettle always kept full. You never stopped hoping, he said gently. Henri looked down at her hands. I suppose I thought, if the sky ever forgave me, it would send her back. That night, Tobias didn't leave. He stayed to help Henri adjust the old telescope, which groaned like an ancient ship. They polished the lens. calibrated the angle. When they opened the dome, the stars poured in like breath held too long. Tobias pulled out something he'd tucked into his satchel. A stack of papers, worn at the corners. "From the library," he explained. "I asked Miss Featherwick if she had any of your newsletters. Thought you might want to read your own voice again." Henri blinked, then laughed. A sound like wind in tall grass. "I was quite dramatic." "Yes," Tobias agreed, "but beautifully so." Then came the surprise. On the back of the final newsletter, written in a different hand. "I read every word that I looked up, just like you asked." Henry's breath caught. Tobias gently turned her to face the telescope. "Go on. Ask the sky again." Henri hesitated only a second. Then she leaned into the eyepiece. A deep inhale, a pause, and then a gasp. It's there. A message." She stepped back, stunned. Tobias took her place and squinted through the lens. There, carefully etched into a small cardboard panel pasted to the inside of the telescope, almost invisible unless you were looking for it, were the words, "I miss you, even from this side of the sky." Henri pressed her hand to her mouth. "She was here. Maybe she never really left," Tobias said. "She just became a constellation you hadn't named yet." By morning, the observatory was alive again. Henri scribbled new charts, sent a fresh newsletter, and wrote a small note to place at the base of the hill. "The stars are speaking again. Come listen." And beneath the telescope's stand, folded like a secret, "I wish to stop mourning the silence and begin listening to the light." Tobias walked home slowly. The cat trotted beside him, unusually quiet. Just as they reached the cobbler's door, she slipped a new letter from her mouth, its edge still warm from delivery. The seal was shaped like a pair of boots. "I wish I knew why he left." Tobias frowned. He recognized the handwriting. His breath caught. It was from her. Chapter 12, The Girl with the Red Boots. The letter sat unopened for hours. Tobias kept it on the workbench, nestled between a half-stitched slipper and a broken brogue he had no intention of mending. The wax seal, a tiny pair of boots, daintily pressed, glinted whenever sunlight moved across the wood. He didn't need to read it. He already knew who it was from. Once, many years ago, he'd made a pair of red boots. Not glossy showpieces. Not the stiff, fashionable kind you could hear clacking up the streets of Montbernard. These were soft, weatherproofed, lined with something he'd dyed himself, warm as a hug on a bad morning. The color was a deep maraschino, chosen not because it suited the girl, but because she insisted it matched the inside of her heart. Her name was Madeline. Maddie when she was laughing. She had worked at the library. Not the main one, but the annex tucked behind the old train station, where no one ever looked for biographies or bird guides. She shelved by whim rather than alphabet, believed books found people at the right moment, and once said that punctuation was like shoes, best when worn with personality. Tobias had loved her with the kind of quiet, aching awe he now reserved for sunsets or the sound of snow. And then, one day, he left. He finally opened the letter when the moon rose full and silver, bathing the cobbler's shop in a soft melancholy. "I wish I knew why he left." There was no bitterness in the strokes, only a kind of wondering that made his throat ache. The black cat appeared silently beside him, tail coiled like a question mark. "I wasn't ready," he whispered, eyes not leaving the page. The cat tilted her head. "Not to love her," Tobias added quickly. "That came too easily. It was myself I wasn't ready to show." He'd never spoken about it to anyone, not even to the ghost of his mother in the attic, where her notebooks still sat gathering dust. Not to the kindly customers who asked why such a talented cobbler lived alone. Not to Henri or Miss Featherwick or even the cat. But Madeline had known something was cracked inside him. Not broken exactly, just unfinished. She once said he made shoes the way some people mended wounds. They'd lived in a tiny flat with windows that rattled in winter and a kitchen too small for both of them to stand in. Madeline made tea by the pot and read aloud from forgotten novels while he stitched beside her. They were poor, happy, a little lonely in places they couldn't always reach in each other. But Tobias had carried a secret, the weight of grief that hadn't found a name yet. His father's leaving, his mother's silence, the childhood spent waiting for people to come back, and then realizing they never would. He'd left one morning with only a satchel and a note that said, "You deserve someone who doesn't vanish when loved." He didn't think she'd keep the boots, but she did. Now, years later, she'd made a wish, and the cat had brought it to him. He didn't know what to do. He wandered the quiet night, through cobbled lanes and beneath crooked street lamps, past closed shops and sleeping bakeries. Montbernard had never felt so small. The cat followed soundlessly, a shadow beside him. And then, at the edge of town, they reached a door Tobias hadn't visited in years. The library annex. The windows still bore mismatched curtains. The bell above the door had a chipped porcelain bird hanging from it. Inside, the same soft smell of old paper and orange peel tea. And behind the counter, stacking a pile of maps like origami, Madeline. She didn't look startled, just quiet, the kind of quiet that came with knowing someone would return eventually. "I thought maybe," she said, placing the last map down, "that I imagined the cat." Tobias managed a small, reverent nod. "You didn't." She smiled faintly. She was always a good judge of unfinished business. They stood in stillness for a long while. "I read your letter," he said at last. "I hoped you would." "I'm sorry," he said. Not a dramatic apology. Not even one that covered all the years and silences. Just a seed of truth. She reached into a drawer and pulled something out. A single red boot. Worn but intact. "I never stopped wearing them," she said. "Only on good days." He laughed. Choked. Sheepish. "And today? I hope today would be a good day." They sat together on the threadbare rug between the fiction and folklore shelves. Tobias told her everything. About the cat, the wishes, the cobbler's vow. The old man with two shadows. The girl who danced in silence. The astronomer who waited for the stars to speak again. Madeline listened, fingers twined around the laces of her boot. "You always believed everyone else's stories mattered," she said. "But yours does too." "I was afraid of it," he admitted. "Still am. But you're living it now." He looked at her and the years melted a little. "I never stopped," he said softly. She smiled. "Me neither." Before he left, he slipped a letter into the cat's collar. Not sealed, not signed. Just one line, written in Tobias's careful hand. "I wish for a second chance, if she still wants it." The next morning, the cat delivered it not to Madeline, but to Tobias. She dropped it at his feet, tail swishing with something smug and knowing. Tobias frowned, confused, then turned it over. Madeline's reply. He opened it slowly. "I never stopped waiting for you, Dum." And beneath that, another line scribbled hastily. "I made you tea. Bring pastries." Tobias left the shop door open that day. The closed sign hung lazily from a nail, spinning slightly in the breeze. Inside, the smell of clove and leather lingered, and a new pair of boots waited patiently by the door. Red again, but this time with gold stitching that caught the light. The black cat curled atop the workbench, purring. And from the window, a new wish fluttered into view, born on the wind, sealed with wax in the shape of a paper plane. It read, "I wish I could say goodbye to the wish I never dared to send. Chapter 13, The Cobbler's Wish. The moon was full again. It bathed Montbernard in soft milk light, casting silver outlines over shutters and rooftops and the tips of the willow trees in the square. The bakery had long since closed, the bell tower had struck midnight, and most of the town dreamed on peacefully. But not Tobias. The cobbler sat at his workbench, hands still, heart loud. A final letter lay before him, the last in a year of full moons and folded wishes. The black cat had delivered it without fanfare, her paws light on the windowsill. She hadn't stayed. This time she'd left almost immediately, pausing only to look back once, as if to say, "This one is yours." The wax seal was shaped like a shoehorn. Simple, plain, unfussy, just like him. The letter was addressed in a hand he didn't recognize, rounded, careful, but uncertain, as if the writer hadn't written a letter in a long time. He opened it slowly, breath caught in the space between knowing and not. "I wish I could remember the wish I never dared to make. E." The name didn't surprise him. E wasn't a person. It was a moment. Many years ago, before Maddie and the Annex Library, before the cobbler's shop and the black cat and even the cracked streets of Montbernard, Tobias had been a boy who spent long summers in the attic of a quiet, whispering house. His mother was a shoemaker of extraordinary gentleness. She believed shoes were maps of the soul. She never rushed a stitch, never made two shoes identical, even in a pair. "One foot always knows where it's going," she'd say. "But the other is learning." When she died, she left behind dozens of notebooks and one unfinished shoe. Just one. The left. The right had never been started. He'd kept that shoe on the highest shelf for years, untouched, until tonight. He took it down gently, dust trailing like breath from the leather. The stitching was half complete. The toe curved ever so slightly upward, as if the wearer had been meant to skip. He remembered the day she began it. A thunderstorm had kept them indoors. He was 9. She'd said, quite suddenly, "I'm making you something for when you're older, something to remind you how to walk forward." He hadn't understood what she meant. But now, all these years later, he did. This was the wish he'd never made. Not because he couldn't, but because it had been made for him. He worked through the night. The second shoe did not match. Not in shape, not in color, not in stitching. And yet they belonged together. Like the stories he'd stitched into other people's lives all year long. Awkward and aching, mismatched and true. By dawn, he'd finished the pair. He set them side by side on the workbench and stared at them in silence, heart full of something vast and still unnamed. Then, without ceremony, he slipped them on and stepped outside. The streets were quiet, but not empty. Here and there, someone stood by their doorstep, as if called out by the hush in the air. Miss Featherwick in her peacock dressing gown. Henri holding a steaming cup and wearing mismatched slippers. Young Pip, still in pajamas, eyes wide. They watched the cobbler walk. Not because it was odd to see him out, or because the shoes on his feet looked like something from an old fairy tale, but because he walked differently. Not slowly, not hurriedly, with purpose. The black cat followed, tail flicking. She led him to the field behind the chapel, where the grass always grew in wild tufts and dandelions ruled the edges. There was nothing special about the place. And yet, as Tobias stepped into it, a wind rose gently, the kind that smelled of lavender and wood smoke and warm memories. In the center of the field stood a tall mirror, framed in twisted iron, covered in ivy. It hadn't been there yesterday. The cat sat beside it, waiting. Tobias approached. The mirror did not show his reflection. Not as it was, anyway. It showed 100 versions of himself. Young and old, laughing and weeping, dancing, dreaming, sewing, leaving, staying. And behind each version, someone different stood. Maddie, his mother, Henri, Miss Featherwick, the girl with the accordion, the silent dancer, the boy with the shadows. All the lives he'd brushed against this year. All the wishes he'd walked through. He stepped closer. The mirror shimmered. And then, without sound, it opened. Like a door. He did not vanish. There was no burst of light. No dramatic ending. Just a soft step forward into something more. Later, People would say they saw the cobbler that day, walking barefoot through town, smiling as if he finally knew the last line of a poem. Others claimed they saw him dancing near the river with a woman in red boots. Some say the black cat disappeared with him, tail flicking one final time. But one thing they all agreed on. After that day, a new shop opened in Montbernard. Not a cobbler's, a bookshop. Its shelves were filled with odd volumes, blank journals that wrote themselves, maps of places that didn't exist yet, picture books that changed depending on the weather. At the back of the shop was a small wooden box. Each full moon, a new letter appeared in it, and above it hung a sign, carved in gentle script. Wishes still welcome. Another story ends, but the cozy never does. See you soon.